She once told me, "You carry the world." I laughed, until I realized she could see the weight I'd hidden from everyone else. Some mornings felt heavier than others. Not because of what I carried in my hands, but because of what I carried in my head, the quiet exhaustion that comes from trying to keep your life from falling apart, piece by piece. I worked at a small bookstore tucked between a bakery and an antique shop, the kind of place where time seemed to hesitate. The shelves leaned under the weight of forgotten stories, and the air always smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. I liked it there. It was peaceful. Predictable. And maybe that's why I stayed, because peace, even when it's lonely, is safer than change. It was during one of those gray afternoons, rain tapping softly against the windows, the world outside blurred and slow, when I first really saw her. She'd been coming in for months, always around the same time. A woman in her 40s, maybe, with that kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to be announced. She walked like she knew where she belonged, yet her eyes told a different story, the kind of softness that comes from having seen too much and still choosing to be kind anyway. That day, the rain was steady, and the shop was nearly empty. She stood by the poetry section, tracing a finger along the spines of the books, lost in thought. I was pretending to organize a shelf nearby, though really, I was just watching her. When she finally approached the counter, she smiled, a small, knowing smile that reached her eyes. "You look tired," she said, almost like she was stating a fact, not a judgment. I laughed it off, rubbing the back of my neck. "It's just been a long week." She nodded slowly, eyes never leaving mine. Long weeks have a way of turning into long years if you're not careful. Something about the way she said it, calm, almost tender, stayed with me. As I handed her the cup of coffee she ordered, our fingers brushed. Just a second, maybe less. But I felt it, that brief warmth, the grounding weight of someone noticing you. Her touch wasn't intentional, but it was steady, and I swear it made the air around us shift. She lingered a moment longer, watching the rain. "You should rest sometimes," she murmured. Even the strongest shoulders weren't made to carry everything alone. Then she left, the door chimed, the rain swallowed her silhouette, and I stood there with her words still echoing somewhere deep inside me. That night, when I closed the shop, I found myself looking at the empty chair where she'd sat. For the first time in a long time, I realized how tired I really was, and how a single kind voice had somehow made the weight feel just a little lighter. After that rainy afternoon, something shifted, quietly, like the air after a storm. She started visiting more often. Never announced, never planned. Some evenings she'd walk in just before closing, a book already in hand, a faint smile waiting at the corner of her lips. Her name was Clara. She told me one evening as she set her coffee down and looked around the shop. "It's peaceful here," she said. "Like the world forgets to rush when I walk through that door." I smiled, wiping down the counter. "That's because the clock in the back hasn't worked in years." She laughed, low, warm, effortless. It filled the quiet space between us, the kind of laugh that lingers in your chest long after it fades. Over the next few weeks, our talks grew longer. At first, it was simple: books, movies, how people always leave half-finished notebooks behind when they move on. But slowly, the conversation stretched beyond small talk. One night, when the last customer had left and the rain was falling again, she stayed to help me stack a few boxes near the window. She asked, "Do you ever feel like you're running on autopilot? Doing things you're good at but not sure you love anymore?" Her tone wasn't casual. It was searching, a soft confession wrapped in curiosity. I hesitated before answering. "Yeah," I said. "More often than I'd like to admit." She nodded, eyes distant, tracing a finger over the rim of her coffee mug. "I used to work as a therapist," she said. "Spent years listening to other people's pain. It took me too long to realize I'd stopped listening to my own." There was a pause, not awkward, just heavy. The kind of silence where both people are thinking of something they're not ready to say. She glanced at me then, the faintest smile touching her lips. You remind me of someone who tries too hard to hold it all together. You don't have to, you know. The lights flickered slightly as a gust of wind pressed against the windows. I could smell the faint blend of rain and cinnamon from the nearby bakery. It was one of those rare moments where the world feels both too big and too intimate, where the distance between two people seems to dissolve without either of them moving. When she reached for her coat, I noticed a small, silver ring on her finger, simple but worn smooth by time. She caught me looking and said quietly, "Don't worry, it's just a memory I still wear." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. As she stepped out into the rain, she paused at the door. "You should get some air," she said, her voice gentle but certain. "You've been holding your breath for too long." And just like that, she was gone again, leaving behind the faint scent of coffee and rainwater, and a question I hadn't realized I needed to answer: when was the last time I really breathed? It was a Saturday when she first invited me over. The shop had closed early for inventory, and as I locked the door, I found Clara waiting outside, umbrella in hand, sunlight slipping through the clouds behind her. "I was heading home to tend to my garden," she said. "You look like you could use some air." I almost said no. It felt strange, crossing that quiet line between customer and something else I couldn't yet name. But there was something about the way she asked, calm, certain, like it wasn't an invitation to visit, but to breathe again. So I said yes. Her home sat at the edge of town, a small house with ivy creeping up the brick and a wooden gate that creaked like it had stories of its own. The air smelled of rosemary, soil, and something faintly sweet, maybe jasmine, maybe her perfume. "This is my escape," she said, motioning to the garden behind the house. "Everything I plant here has survived something." The space was alive, overflowing, imperfect, beautiful. Herbs tangled with wildflowers. Old terracotta pots leaned on one another like old friends. There was no symmetry, no plan, just quiet life growing freely. She handed me a trowel. "If you're here, you work," she teased. I laughed, kneeling beside her as she showed me how to loosen the soil around the roots. Our hands brushed when she passed me a small pot. Her touch was unhurried, deliberate, but gentle, the kind that carries meaning even when it doesn't mean to. As we worked, she spoke about her past in fragments, how she'd once lived in the city, how the noise became too loud, how she left her job to find a quieter kind of healing. "People always came to me to talk," she said softly, pressing her fingers into the earth. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to listen to silence. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened, the way she always did for me." The rhythm of our movements filled the pauses between words, soil falling from her hands, the rustle of leaves, a bird somewhere calling from a tree. When I glanced up, she was looking at me, not in that distracted way people look when they're polite, but really looking. "You carry things too," she said after a while. "You're young, but your eyes, they already know the weight of disappointment." Her words caught me off guard, tender, but disarming. I smiled faintly. "I guess we both collect things that don't belong to us." She brushed the dirt off her hands, then reached out and touched my sleeve, a light, grounding touch that made my chest tighten for reasons I didn't understand. "Maybe," she said softly, "it's time we learn to plant something we don't have to carry." We stayed there until the sun dipped behind the rooftops, talking about nothing and everything, the way some conversations don't need purpose, only presence. When I left that evening, the scent of her garden clung to my clothes, rosemary, soil, and something else I couldn't quite name. It stayed with me long after I got home. Maybe it wasn't the smell of flowers at all. Maybe it was the feeling of being understood. It became a quiet habit, closing the shop, locking the door, and finding her waiting outside, a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, her smile soft and knowing. "Walk with me," she'd ask. And I always did. Our paths were never far, through narrow streets that smelled of rain and bread, past the park where the lamps hummed like old secrets. The world felt quieter beside her, as if time slowed to match our steps. That night, The sky was bruised purple, the air cool and damp after an early drizzle. She spoke about small things, the way the light changes in October, how she used to write letters she never sent. But eventually, her voice softened. You ever feel like you're pretending to be fine so people don't worry? The question hung in the air between us, gentle but sharp. I took a moment before answering. Every day. She nodded, as though she'd expected that. You remind me of someone I used to know, she said. He carried everything quietly until it started to show in the way he stood. I glanced at her. What happened to him? She smiled faintly, looking up at the darkening sky. He learned to set some things down. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was heavy, meaningful. I could hear the steady rhythm of our steps, the faint rush of wind through the trees. Her scarf brushed my sleeve as we walked, and I felt the warmth of her presence ripple through me like an echo I didn't know I needed. When we reached the end of the street, a light flickered above a small cafe, half closed for the night. She stopped, resting her hand gently on my arm, not to hold me back, but to anchor me. Her touch was feather-light, her fingers cool from the air. But it was enough. Enough to still everything inside me. She looked at me then, really looked. Her gaze steady, searching. You carry the world, don't you? The words landed deep. I wanted to laugh it off, to shrug and say something easy, but all that came out was silence. Her eyes softened. Then maybe, she said, let someone lift it with you. The streetlight hummed overhead. A breeze swept through, carrying the faint scent of her perfume, something clean and earthy, like sandalwood and rain. For a heartbeat, I thought of reaching for her hand. But I didn't. It didn't feel like the right moment, not yet. Instead, we just stood there, the space between us alive with something unspoken, something both terrifying and beautiful. Eventually, she smiled, small, almost shy, and nodded toward the road ahead. Come on. The world's lighter when you walk through it. So I followed her, step by step, the echo of her words lingering like the rhythm of a song that refuses to fade. That night, long after I'd gone home, I realized I could still feel where her hand had rested on my arm, not heavy, not fleeting, just steady. Like she'd meant it. It started with a simple message. A small note slipped under the shop door one Sunday morning, written in her careful, looping handwriting. The shelf I was trying to fix finally gave up. I think it just needs steadier hands. I smiled when I read it. Somehow, her words always carried more than they said. By afternoon, I found myself standing at her doorstep, toolbox in hand, pretending it was just about the shelf. Her house looked different in daylight, quieter, warmer. The curtains were half drawn, sunlight spilling in soft strips across the wooden floor. The scent of her garden drifted in through the open windows, a mix of rosemary and lavender. Come in, she said, her voice bright but easy. You didn't have to bring all that. I wasn't sure what I'd need, I replied, and she smiled like she could see right through the excuse. The shelf wasn't really broken, just loose at the joints, a few nails out of place. Still, we worked together, our movements quiet and unhurried. She steadied the wood while I hammered, her hand brushing mine now and then. Each time, it lingered a second longer than it needed to. When we finished, she handed me a cup of tea. You've earned this, she said. We sat on the floor, backs against the wall, tools still scattered around us. The air hummed softly, the kind of silence that only exists when two people feel safe enough not to fill it. She leaned her head back, eyes half closed, letting out a tired sigh. Do you ever stop trying? I turned toward her. Trying what? To be enough, she said. Her words floated out gently, but I could feel the weight in them. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around her living room, the faint clutter of a life half-sorted. Books stacked in uneven piles. Photos tucked into frames. A plant growing crooked toward the light. I think if I stopped trying, I said slowly, everything might fall apart. Her gaze shifted toward me then, soft but unwavering. Maybe things don't fall apart, she said. Maybe they just change shape. The air between us thickened, not with tension, but with understanding. She reached for her tea, and as she did, her sleeve brushed my arm. Just that, a whisper of contact, yet it was enough to make every thought in my head go quiet. When she handed me my cup, our fingers touched. This time, neither of us moved away. Her skin was warm, steady. For a moment, we just looked at each other, not searching for words, not hiding behind them. "Thank you," she said softly. "You make things lighter, without even trying." I wanted to tell her she did the same for me. But the words caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. So instead, I just smiled, and stayed beside her in that quiet, sunlit room, letting the world outside wait a little longer. Because some moments don't pass. They stay, quietly, without asking permission. For a few days after that afternoon in her living room, I couldn't shake the feeling of her hand against mine, that small, steady warmth that had lingered long after I'd gone. It was all I thought about, though I tried not to. At the shop, I caught myself glancing toward the door more often than I should have. Some part of me expected her to walk in like always, calm and unassuming, her presence filling the air with something I couldn't name. But she didn't. 3 days passed. Then 5. Then a week. And in the silence that followed, I began to question everything. Had I crossed a line? Misread something? Was I imagining the quiet understanding that seemed to live between us? The uncertainty gnawed at me. I told myself to forget it, that maybe what I felt wasn't meant to be returned. But forgetting her felt like trying to erase the sound of rain once you'd already stepped into it. One evening, as I was restocking shelves, I found something unusual. A small book of poetry had been left on the counter, wrapped in brown paper. My name was written on the front in her familiar, looping handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. Inside the cover, she'd tucked a note. "We all carry something heavy. But gentleness isn't weakness, it's the courage to keep soft in a hard world." My chest tightened. I didn't need to read the rest. I knew what it meant. She'd felt the distance too. That night, I walked to her house. The garden lights were off, and her windows glowed faintly from inside. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised, just quiet, as if she'd been expecting me. "I wasn't sure if you wanted to see me," I said. Her smile was soft, a little sad. "I wasn't sure if you wanted to be seen." The way she said it, honest, unguarded, stripped away every defense I'd built. "I got your note," I said. "You were right. I was afraid." She nodded, stepping aside to let me in. The house smelled of rain again, that same familiar calm. "It's all right to be afraid," she said gently. "It means something matters." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the house. Then, without thinking, I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and she didn't pull away. Her fingers met mine halfway, warm and sure. We stood there, still, hands barely intertwined, our breathing sinking without trying. There was no confession, no rush, just the quiet understanding that something fragile and real had begun to take shape between us. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." And for the first time in years, I believed it. The weeks that followed moved differently, slower, somehow softer. It wasn't that life suddenly became lighter. It was that I stopped trying to hold it all by myself. Clara and I didn't talk about what had happened that night. There was no need to name it. It lived in the way she'd brush her hand against mine when passing a cup, or how her eyes found me across a crowded shop. Small, wordless acknowledgments that said everything we didn't have to. One evening, she asked if I'd help her with something. "I'm hosting a little reading in the garden," she said, smiling as she handed me a flyer she'd written by hand. "Poetry, stories, maybe some laughter. The world feels heavy again, people need softness. I helped her string lights between the trees, their glow flickering like distant fireflies as the sun went down. The air was cool, carrying the scent of lavender and damp earth. Music played softly from a small speaker, something calm and old, the kind of melody that asks nothing but to be listened to. When guests began to arrive, I saw Clara move among them with that quiet grace she carried so naturally, laughing, listening, touching shoulders gently as she spoke. And for the first time, I saw her not as someone holding herself together, but as someone who had healed enough to hold others again. She called me over near the end of the night. "Read something," she said, her eyes glinting under the lights. I hesitated, but she only smiled. "Don't think, just speak." So I opened one of the old books from the shop and read aloud. The words trembled at first, then settled, a poem about burdens shared, about finding light in unlikely places. When I looked up, Clara was watching me, her expression soft, her hand pressed loosely to her chest. After the guests left and the night grew quiet, we stayed behind to gather the chairs. The garden glowed under the last few strings of light, the air thick with the warmth of everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't. "You carry the world," she said suddenly, almost in a whisper. I smiled, setting down a chair. "Not alone anymore." She stepped closer then, until we were standing face to face. The night hummed around us, the faint buzz of the lights, the chirp of crickets in the distance. Her hand rose, resting gently on my shoulder, her thumb brushing once, almost absent-mindedly. For a long, quiet moment, we simply stood there, her forehead leaning lightly against mine, breath mingling, heart steady. No words. No promises. Just understanding. In that stillness, I realized something simple: love isn't always loud or certain. Sometimes it's just the quiet choice to lift the world, together. When she finally smiled, it was the same soft smile I'd first seen in the bookstore months ago. But now, I understood what it meant. It wasn't an invitation. It was home.